Welcome everybody to the final webinar on our Creativity is the Future series. If you're joining us on social media, the hashtag for today is #CreateEDU. Today's topic is the future of digital learning.
I'm ready, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. It's terrific. And I hope that you will have a very lively dialogue in the dialogue box while I'm talking. Because there are so many people, I'm going to present my ideas straight through, knowing that you can have a discussion while the talk is going on. And then at the end, I'm hoping that we'll have some time for me to respond to questions and comments as well. So I'm going to talk about two things. I'll talk about a general picture of what we should be trying to achieve in the future of education. And then I'm going to talk about some work that my colleagues and I are doing that will aid in teaching creativity, collaboration, and leadership skills, which are very important for the future. So my own teaching has been guided by a publication that the National Research Council brought out in 2012 called Education for Life and Work in the 21st Century. You can download it for free as a PDF file from the National Research Council website. I urge you to take a look at it because it talks about how a really good education in 1995 is now not a good education for the 21st century. The 21st century is quite different than the 20th century. We've moved from a national industrial economy to a global, knowledge-based, innovation-centered economy. Now, one of the interesting things to me about the report is that it divides the kinds of knowledge and skills that students are going to need into three buckets: cognitive, intrapersonal, and interpersonal. And you can see on the slide some of the kinds of things that go into each bucket, and I'll talk about those in a minute in more detail. The reason that the report does this is there's a lot of research now that shows a decade after you graduate from any level of education, whether it's high school or college or graduate school, a decade later, your success in life is more determined by your intrapersonal and interpersonal skills than by your cognitive skills and knowledge. That doesn't mean that all three aren't important, but we've all worked with people who were really smart and really knowledgeable, but they were actually incredibly different to work with and difficult to work with and kind of a liability to their organization because they had so many challenges on the intrapersonal and the interpersonal level. So in the 21st century especially, where more and more work is done by teams, not just by individuals on some kind of assembly line, it's really important that we develop skills in all three of these buckets. And I went to the report and I pulled out some skills to put into this matrix. And I'd like you to look at these cells in the matrix and ask yourself two questions. The first is, for the curricula that you're involved with, no matter what your role is and what level of students you're teaching or working with in terms of their learning, which cells are getting a lot of attention in that curriculum and which cells are getting almost none? Because this is a question I find myself asking not only about my own teaching, but also about the graduate courses that we offer at Harvard as part of our master's degree. When our students graduate, how are we doing at providing a footprint on this matrix? Then the second question I'd like you to think about is, for the skills that we assess, and for the accountability systems that we have, for what teachers are held accountable, how does that map onto this matrix? And I think most people find that some cells are getting a lot of attention, and other cells that are clearly going to be very important for the 21st century are getting almost none. And when we look at assessment instead of curriculum, the picture is even worse. There are very important sets of skills that we have almost no way of assessing, and so the accountability system is skewing what we're doing in some very unfortunate directions. So as we do our work at Harvard in the master's program, one of the things that's been evocative for me is the cover of a book that was published in the 1970s. And the book is about how the work of a mathematician, an artist, and a musician were all fundamentally similar. Now, the author of the book carved those wooden artifacts that you see in the center. And they're carved so that if you shine a light through them from one direction, you get an E, another direction a G, another direction a B. So it's reflecting the fact that the artifact is the thing that the musician, the artist, and the mathematician were all somehow caught up in. On the slide that I just showed you, there were 20 sets of knowledge and skills. Our challenge as educators, as we design a whole suite of learning experiences, and we say to students, okay, you've gone through this, now you're ready to go out into the world, we need a 20-dimensional or a 25-dimensional artifact in order to be able to say, yes, we've succeeded. Which means we can't really teach one thing at a time. We can't teach like we're playing a little melody, one note at a time. We have to play in chords. We have to teach content, some kind of cognitive skill, some kind of intrapersonal skill, some sort of interpersonal skill simultaneously if we're going to get through everything that we need to prepare kids for the future. Now, that NRC report that I described also talks about what are the kinds of teaching strategies that are likely to be successful if this is the challenge. And they describe some teaching strategies called deeper learning. And with the sponsorship of the Hewlett Foundation and Jobs for the Future, I wrote a white paper on this topic, the role of digital technologies in deeper learning. That's also available on the web. You can download it for free. I'm not going to describe the full set of ideas in the white paper today, just a part of them, but I hope that my presentation will be interesting enough that you'll want to learn more about deeper learning and the role of technologies, and you'll go take a look at that. And what I've done is to take the parts of deeper learning that we very seldom see in classrooms because they're difficult for teachers to do in the constraints of a school or a university, and talk about those. So learning that's based on cases out of the real world. This is something that Harvard specializes in the business school and the medical school and the law school. Learning that's very collaborative because you've got those skills needed when you graduate in the 21st century. Apprenticeships that help you learn things that you can't possibly learn in a classroom setting. Learning outside of the school place and the school time. Learning for transfer, because we find that students that get A's in colleges or in schools, when they go into the world, often they can't apply those skills because nothing looks like a multiple choice test. Nothing looks like an essay. So how do we teach for transfer? Interdisciplinary studies, because the world's intrinsically interdisciplinary. And finally, diagnostic assessments, because if students are struggling, we need to know what's going wrong and how to intervene right then, not in some kind of summative assessment that's too late. So that's a set of goals for the future, that somehow we need to look in these three buckets and to find a suite of knowledge and skills that's going to be prepare students well, and then we need to use strategies like deeper learning in school and out, in classrooms and in the world, in order to help students attain all those skills at the same time, to have that complex artifact at the center. So what might an artifact like that look like? That's what I want to do in the second part of the talk, to give you two specific cases. So I'm trying to walk my talk. I'm trying to do deeper learning about deeper learning. I'm going to give you two specific cases that describe artifacts that might do at least part of what I'm discussing. So the first is called EcoMove, and it is a curriculum for ecosystem science in the middle school but it could go up into the college or even into graduate work, and it could go down into the elementary school by modifying the way that we put it together. That curriculum is based on digital ecosystems. So we took a real ecosystem and we simulated it, and then we gave students the opportunity, even if they're sitting in a barren classroom in the middle of the winter, to be at a pond in the middle of the summer or a forest where they can learn ecosystem science. It's hard to convey that in words, so what I'd like to do is show you part of a video that illustrates the kinds of things that can go on inside of EcoMove. So we'll bring that video up, and hopefully even with so many people here in the portal, we'll be able to run it in a way that you can see what's going on. So as you watch this, think about the cognitive, the intrapersonal, and the interpersonal skills that this kind of experience might be fostering.
EcoMove is an exciting new curriculum research project at the Harvard Graduate School of Education that uses immersive virtual environments to teach middle school students about ecosystems and causal patterns. It includes 2 computer-based modules, Pond and Forest, within a 4-week inquiry-based ecosystems curriculum. Here we are in the pond module. We can walk around the pond and see all the different plants and animals, like these ducks. The camera tool lets us take pictures, and saving the photo displays a virtual field guide with information about each of the organisms we find. We can also walk under the water to see the species living there. And using a virtual microsubmarine, we can shrink down and see the microscopic life in the pond at different levels of magnification.
This gives students a profound respect for why you don't drink pond water.
The environment around the pond includes features like a golf course, roads, and houses. Following this runoff pipe leads us to a drainage ditch near a new housing development, where we meet a landscaper putting down fertilizer. Throughout the environment, on different days, we meet virtual characters like Manny, who may provide useful information. Back at the pond, the water measurement tools let us take various measurements of the water in the pond, such as phosphates and turbidity. Students can collect weather and population data as well. The calendar tool lets us travel through time in order to see how the pond has changed on different days. Here, it's raining. When we walk under the water, we can see how cloudy the water is. The turbidity is higher, and we can also take another measurement. The data view lets us see and compare data we've collected. The Atom Tracker tool lets us see what happens to atoms in the ecosystem over time. We can find and track 3 atoms, carbon, phosphorus, and oxygen. On each simulated day, we can find the atom tracker signs and read a description of what has happened to each atom since our last visit. Here we see an oxygen atom that is part of a water molecule in the leaf of a tree. And then on our next visit, we see that through photosynthesis, the oxygen atom is being released into the air as part of an O2 molecule. As students explore different days at the pond, they discover that on July 28th, all the large fish in the pond are dead. Through the inquiry-based curriculum, students work in teams to collect and analyze data in order to figure out what killed the fish. Once the students have collected all the data, they can use the graphing tool to compare different variables to help them create concept maps that explain why the fish died. Through an exploration of the pond scenario within this immersive simulated environment, students develop a richer understanding of complex causal relationships in ecosystems.
So I'm going to stop the video there. It is a longer video. The second part talks about the forest digital ecosystem, and you're welcome to go to the website and take a look at the longer video. EcoMove has been released under a free license from Harvard, so if you're intrigued by the possibilities of a curriculum like this, you can go to the website, you can sign up, and you'll have an opportunity to download the digital ecosystems, a teacher's guide, supplementary curricular materials. We're happy that we're able to make this available. Now, let me note a couple things that relate to the issue of teaching not only ecosystem science and scientific inquiry, but also really complicated things like complex causality that typically aren't taught until college. They're not taught typically in middle school. And also to develop some intrapersonal and interpersonal skills. So for example, the teams have roles, and the curriculum is developed using a jigsaw pedagogy. So in order to succeed in understanding what killed the fish, you are relying on your teammates to collect the kind of data that they have in order to be able to put the puzzle together. And this is a powerful way of building collaboration, and it also provides opportunities for leadership. In addition, the curriculum is based on a lot of things in an ecosystem that's quite complicated. There's a huge number of species. There's not only the flow of matter that the atom tracker is showing, but the flow of energy through the system that you can look at through a food web. And so there's a lot of opportunities for students to be creative in terms of thinking about where different species might be and how to find them. Some of them are not particularly easy to find. And then thinking about how the food web illustrates the flow of energy. Now, one of the things that's important we know in developing these skills is not just to have a one-size-fits-all experience, but to provide the opportunity to personalize. And the roles help to personalize that to some extent. But beyond the roles, we want to really be able to craft the curriculum to each student's knowledge and interests and passions and weaknesses, because that's how they're going to get success in the 21st century. So one of the interesting things about not only virtual worlds, but also augmented realities, which you'll see later, and social media for that matter, is that they live on a server. And so you get log files with timestamps. And so for each learner, we know second by second what they're doing inside of the EcoMove. Now those log files are intellectually indigestible. They're very long, they're very complicated, you're looking at a lot of micro actions. And what we have to do is to work with skilled teachers to understand how to cluster the behaviors to make them meaningful, and then develop rubrics that can be scored by a machine so that the computer can keep track of what students seem to know and don't know at any particular point. And then we're working to develop ways of providing feedback to students and teachers that's diagnostic, that's really timely, so that if they're getting stuck or they're struggling or there's a particular set of skills that they're not making much progress on, we can help them out. These are actually images from a prior curriculum we did called River City, and we showed each student their path through the world each time they went and their team's path, and then we compared that to an expert team. On the right you see a heat map, which is something that students are often familiar with from gaming. Green shows where high-performing students are spending their time. Pink shows where lower-performing students are spending their time. This is the kind of feedback that really helps students to improve rapidly and gives teachers clues as to who is struggling. We also built individualized guidance into River City and are doing that in EcoMove. And by the guidance not only personalizes, but in the log files we can see who's using the guidance and where they seem to be stuck. And that's of value. Some of you may be familiar with gaming and animated pedagogical agents. People like entities that are run by the computer rather than run by a person. And those agents inside of our world not only can provide information, like Manny the landscaper, But they can also ask students questions, and by looking at the kinds of answers that students give to questions, we get a sense of where they're succeeding and where they're failing. We can also use different worlds to test for transfer and to test for summative outcomes, how much have students really learned. And so the forest curriculum, we can watch students who've done the pond first and see what they're able to transfer over into that curriculum. And finally, at the end, students have a science conference, and they prepare concept maps that show the interrelationships they think led to the fish kill, or in the case of the forest, the predator-prey relationships that led to dramatic differences between two islands. And at the science conference, they can present the kinds of findings that they've come up with and have another opportunity for collaboration in the real world rather than in the virtual world. So as we study this as researchers and designers, we find that we've got an artifact that is able to speak to a lot of the kinds of dimensions that I talked about earlier, dimensions from the National Research Council report, not just content knowledge and scientific inquiry and complex causality, but also tenacity and engagement and collaboration and leadership and creativity are things that good teachers can foster in this environment. The environment itself doesn't magically create those things happening. It takes skilled teachers in order to help students to attain that. But the partnership between the tool, which is collecting all of this diagnostic information, and the teacher who is working to help students attain those complicated skills is a powerful one. And if you think back to deeper learning and the idea of case-based learning and learning for transfer and apprenticeships, this is a way, even within the limits of the classroom, using virtual worlds is a way that students can have a simulated apprenticeship that does foster transfer, that does speak to case-based learning and collaboration, that carries out a lot of those deeper learning ideas. So again, EcoMove is available for free. You can go to the website, take a look at it, download it, play with it. If you do decide to use it with students, we'd love to hear about what you're doing with it. Now, at the end of a month doing the full EcoMove curriculum, what do we think we know about students? We think we know a lot about inquiry, and we know some things about collaboration and leadership. We know quite a bit about their self-efficacy in science, whether they believe they could be a scientist. We know some things about their metacognition, their thinking about thinking. We know a little bit about things like their creativity. But a month in a few class sessions isn't a very long time. So the hope is that more and more curriculum will start to move in this direction, and we'll have these kinds of diagnostic performance-based assessments built into it, so that over the course of a year, we might really be able to understand collaboration or leadership or creativity in a much deeper way than is possible in just a single curriculum that takes part of the year. And I think the key thing about all of this, beyond the richness of the experience and the apprenticeship, is this diagnostic assessment that's formative for instruction. It's very important to give people feedback in close to real time about where they're succeeding and where they're not succeeding. If you're a teacher and you've got students doing project-based learning or some other form of learning by doing, it's virtually impossible for you to do that for everyone. But if the tool is developed in a way that can help you, then that becomes much more possible. And that's the digital future that we're all hoping to see. Now I want to switch and talk about my second case. And my second case is more the life-wide learning outside of the school place and the school time. I want to remind you that the first powerful handheld device for learning came out almost 4 decades ago, the Little Professor calculator from Texas Instruments. Some of you may remember this. One of the tragedies of my life is that I now look like the Little Professor. I really never thought I would get this old. And of course our modern devices, and I see I forgot to update the slide to 2015, our modern devices are much more powerful than the little professor in a whole bunch of ways and give us some very powerful ways of learning life-wide. So what we're currently working on is a complement to EcoMove called EcoMobile. And EcoMobile is not about being in a classroom and getting into a simulated ecosystem like a flight simulator. It's about being in the real world, but having a mobile device that helps you to understand what you're seeing. So if the metaphor for EcoMove is like Alice in Wonderland, going through the monitor window into a virtual environment, the metaphor for EcoMobile is a little like the Terminator, if you remember that movie. The robot has magic eyes, and it sees the world, but it sees overlays on the world. So as you watch the video that we're about to show about EcoMobile, think about the same questions that I asked you for EcoMove. As you see the video, what are the opportunities for leadership, for creativity, for collaboration, for science inquiry, for learning about ecosystems, for covering in a rich way a lot of these dimensions that we have to succeed in to prepare students for the 21st century.
EcoMobile is a program we've been developing for middle school students that helps them to connect with their learning in the classroom with the real-world experience. So they've been able to work in the classroom in their science class with a multi-user virtual environment where they explore a virtual pond and they act like scientists to collect information about an ecological mystery that's happened at the virtual pond. But then now we've developed EcoMobile to allow the students to take some of the pieces that they're learning about in the classroom and learn more about them in the real world. So we've developed an augmented reality game that the students can play on smartphones using a 3G wireless network at a real pond. So as the students move around the real environment, they encounter hotspots, and at the hotspots there is information that connects with what they were learning in the classroom. Things like what's a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer, or allows them to take measurements of the pond to test its water quality. So the students have been coming out with us to the pond environment and going on field trips and using augmented reality to connect their experiences with the classroom.
Wants to know what is the most common type of organism you observe. Honestly, we've observed a lot of producers because we see a lot of green. And all of these plants and trees are producers. They all produce stuff. Yeah.
The kids have been very excited to use the smartphone devices, and it's amazing to see how quickly they can pick it up and use it to its full capacity. It took a very short introduction for the kids to be able to navigate with the device and to access these hotspots, and they were figuring things out and troubleshooting together. It was really fun to see them work together to solve some of the problems that they were encountering, and you know, one student might not quite understand how something worked, and another student was right there to help them figure it out. Some of the programs they're using and the probes that they're using are very similar to what real scientists use to monitor ecosystems. And so they're getting experiences that rival what real scientists do, and they realize that, and they see things about the water quality and start to understand what this means.
So I'm going to stop there, but again, this is part of a longer video. If you go to the website for EcoMobile, you can see the longer video. We're grateful to the funders that have made both EcoMove and EcoMobile possible, the National Science Foundation, the Institute of Education Sciences and the U.S. Department of Education, Texas Instruments, Qualcomm's Wireless Reach, and the two of these complement one another in very interesting ways. So EcoMove is like the flight simulator, and you can do magical things that you can't do in the real world, like go back and forth in time and simulate a fish kill. But EcoMobile is like really flying the airplane, and so it's more of a near transfer environment, and you have opportunities to collect data just as a scientist would collect it. As researchers, of course, we're interested in studying this to understand where we're succeeding and failing, and one of the things that we've had fun doing is putting GoPro cameras on the students' heads. Some of you may be familiar with this technology from this sort of gaming and sports community, and we find that we get very rich records from the students' point of view of what they're looking at and what they're doing, and when they're getting together in a group and talking to other people, we can pick up all of the conversation. So it really gives us an opportunity to see how EcoMobile is different than EcoMove and what are the kinds of things that students are gaining, including things like leadership or collaboration or creativity, by looking at these kinds of very rich records about students. So EcoMobile is still a research project. It's not quite ready for prime time, but we're hoping within the next year to release templates so that if a teacher is interested in using our EcoMobile curriculum, say for a water-based ecosystem, if they've got a pond, there'll be a template for a pond. But maybe they have a swamp. Well, we'll have a template for that, for a marsh, for a bog, for a drainage ditch, for a stream. Whatever a teacher can find, we can try to develop a template for it as long as it's got some water in it. So we're hoping to see a wide variety of different things appearing that are augmented realities. Both of these, both virtual worlds and augmented realities, as vehicles for this type of deeper learning, these simulated apprenticeships of different kinds, are containers into which a lot of stuff can go. So we're doing ecosystem science, but you can imagine doing history, where students take their own neighborhood and augment it. They go to people's houses, they get down the old photos from the attic, and they create visions of what that neighborhood was like in the past. So there's many different ways that these flexible media can be used across the curriculum and at different ages in order to do deeper learning for 21st century skills. We're simply trying to demonstrate what the possibilities are by picking one particular age level and one particular subject. Augmented reality actually contradicts something that educators have been saying to students for millennia, for thousands of years. We've been saying to students, if you want to know about the world, you've got to get away from the world. The world is complicated. The world is noisy. The world is confusing. Come to the forum with Socrates. Come to the medieval campus at Harvard. Come to the industrial era school and the classroom, and we'll teach you about the world away from the world. But now in the 21st century, with modern technologies and deeper learning, we can say something new. We can say, but when you're in the world, you're going to have a device with you that understands who you are, how you like to learn, where you are, what around you has been augmented for learning, who you like to learn with, and how to reach them. That's a really powerful vision. And we hope not only to see virtual worlds inside of schools and colleges and other kinds of learning environments, but augmented realities that complement those throughout life, produced by students as well as by educators. So in the 2010 National Education Technology Plan, and I was one of 16 people on the technical working group that produced the plan, our vision that was parallel to what the National Research Council talked about was life-wide learning. If you think of this graphic as like a clock, at about 10:30 there is the classroom with the teacher. That's not going to go away. That's very important. But the rest of the circle is all about opportunities throughout life and people throughout life who can play educational roles. And by developing virtual worlds and augmented realities that go inside and outside these different environments, we believe that we can accomplish much more with deeper learning. But that's going to require a kind of connected teaching. And the National Ed Tech Plan in 2010, and of course you can download that for free too on the internet, talks about the kinds of teaching that are needed, where the teacher in the classroom is coordinating a lot of what's happening with the school and the student throughout life. Now, this isn't an easy shift to make, this kind of teaching, because it's a very different model of instruction. It's not about the teacher providing students with information that's pre-digested experience. It's about students experiencing things directly in simulated apprenticeships and internships. It's not about knowledge living inside of a reading or inside of a lecture. It's about knowledge being in a context and distributed across a community of people that are understanding that context. It's not about tests and essays as measures of quality, although those do capture some part of what students are learning. It's about experiences and accomplishments and reputations as measures of quality. And so when I think about what the biggest barrier is to this, vision of what the future might be, it's really about the human side. The technologies are there. The economics can favor this kind of teaching and learning. But how do we learn to do it well? Because we teach as we're taught. And I was taught by lecture, and so I began teaching doing lectures. And it's taken a lot of work on my part to rethink my whole approach to teaching and learning in order to be effective in preparing my students for the 21st century. And in that process, interestingly enough, the core skill isn't so much learning as unlearning. We're all good at learning, but it's very hard to unlearn those old beliefs and assumptions and values about teaching that are almost unconscious because we spent all those years as students in a traditional system and then all those years teaching in conventional ways. So I think part of the power of these virtual environments and augmented realities is not only the chance to learn, but the chance to unlearn and to work together, to collaborate together, to provide leadership for one another in the unlearning process. So I'm going to wrap up because I want to make sure that we have time for my hearing your comments and questions and responding to those. This is an optical illusion. You should be able to see an older person and a younger person with her face turned away, but you can't see both at the same time because of the way that the brain works. Now, when I describe what's going on with these virtual worlds and augmented realities and opportunities for deeper learning and complex artifacts for the 21st century, some people that are very much into digital textbooks get excited and they say, oh, Chris, this is great. Now, instead of having a static image in a print textbook, we can have a little virtual world in an electronic textbook. And kids can do the reading and then they can muck around a little bit in the world. And then when they're walking home to get ready to do their homework, maybe they'll walk through an augmented reality that'll keep them engaged and excited and ready to wrestle with those homework problems. That's the old person. That's taking the old pedagogy and sprinkling a little technology fairy dust on top of it to make it more interesting. And frankly, that's not going to buy us very much. That's not going to get us, I believe, to where we need to go for the 21st century. But with the same things, we can do the young person. We don't really understand her. Her face is turned away. But here, the core of learning would be the experiences. You would begin with a virtual world or an augmented reality or some other form of learning by doing. And students would struggle and they'd be confused and they'd get frustrated. They'd say, I don't know how to do this. And then just in time, we bring in the knowledge that's in the curriculum, the skills that teachers know how to convey, the things that help you get to the next level as you struggle with these challenges that the environment is facing for you. And you collaborate with your friends, and you're creative, and you're a leader, and you're a follower, and you figure it out together. I think it's that young person that is truly the future of digital education. I hope that the talk today has given you some part of a vision of what that might be, and I hope that working together we can achieve this bright future. So thanks for listening to a rather long presentation. And now we can spend our remaining time just with my trying to respond to whatever you want to say to me.
So Chris, I do want to bring attention to a couple of questions that people asked throughout the presentation. Some of them have to do with the linear model of educational institutions right now. The kind of the modeling after, that industrial factory, line. Jim kind of said, how do you sync what you're doing with the innovative practices with some of the other structures that are currently in place? Or is the goal to try to break the linear model and kind of allow some natural learning environments to happen?
Well, if you believe in transfer, Jim, and thank you for the question, what happens to kids in learning environments needs to look like the world that they're going to move into. And organizations that we see around us today are not linear and hierarchical. They are distributed. They involve a lot of networked leadership rather than top-down leadership. And so if students are going to succeed in that kind of setting, they need to practice in a setting that mirrors that. So yes, I think that we need to move away from the classic organizational structures that characterize the medieval university like Harvard and the industrial era school into something that is truly like what the 21st century is. And the life-wide learning gives us an opportunity to do that because it's intrinsically distributed and networked, and leadership and collaboration are infused throughout it. Now, it's easier said than done to understand how we make that transition, but I think it's central to our being able to succeed and bring these kinds of innovations into kids' learning experiences.
I'll just bring attention to a different question from Mara, and Mary kind of touched upon this as well. Actually, Elizabeth. You said at some point that formative assessment is much richer than summative, and Mara kind of compounded that summative assessment allows you to adjust in real time your lesson. Can you speak to the formative assessment, summative discussion again?
Sure. So summative assessment comes at the end, and it's a way of concluding what you've learned and what you haven't learned. So I'm teaching my students at Harvard. We're coming up to the end of the semester. I'm going to do a kind of a summative assessment for each of them that says this is what you've accomplished and not accomplished. And that's certainly valuable. But in order to help them do well on that summative assessment, I need to use a lot of formative assessment that's diagnostic, so that I can say 5 weeks into the semester, you really seem to be understanding this part of what I'm trying to teach you about the evolution of technology and educational transformation, but this other part you're really kind of struggling with. How can I help you? Here's some resources that might be useful, and so on. And personalization involves our being able to do that in a rich way for every single student. Now, the interesting thing to me is that if we really get good at diagnostic assessment that's formative, we won't need summative assessments at the end, because we'll have a much richer sense of what students know and don't know through a whole trajectory of their learning accomplishments than we will with some kind of a drive-by, one-time snapshot in a summative test or assessment of some kind. So the goal of formative assessment isn't simply, although simply may be the wrong term, it isn't only to help us be more effective in getting students to succeed, but also in the long run, I think it can be the major mechanism by which we assess our educational outcomes rather than some kind of minor mechanism just used by teachers.
So Chris, are you saying that the journey is better than the destination?
I am. I'm saying that the journey tells us much more than the destination does, and that if the journey is rich enough, you find that you get to a destination that's far beyond what you thought you could have done.
I like that. So one question asked about the tinkering school model, the kind of project-based, inquiry-based areas. They want to know kind of your thoughts on that. Is there a good age for that? Do you think that any students at any age need some more guidance and direct instruction, or is just that kind of open learning environment appropriate for all levels? I think that's the question.
You know, I believe that learning is incredibly diverse from one person to another. Let's talk about 3 common human activities: sleeping, eating, and bonding with other people. Almost everybody sleeps in pretty much the same way. If you're designing hotel rooms, no matter where you are in the world and what the language is that people speak, or the kind of socioeconomic background they come from, or the educational level they're at, you can design an environment that will help them sleep. Eating is much more diverse. What you like to eat is determined by your culture, it's determined by your budget, it's determined by your individual preferences. And so people who design restaurants have a much more complex task than designing hotel rooms, figuring out the right atmosphere and the right kinds of service and the right kind of menu. And bonding is more complicated still. People bond to pets, they bond to sports teams, they bond to people of the same gender, of the opposite gender, they bond in a lot of rich and interesting ways. We treat learning as if it were like sleeping, but learning is really like bonding, or certainly like eating. People are incredibly diverse in how they like to learn. And I see this in my own teaching, where I have students who really like the Twitter chat and the moves and the synchronous virtual interactions, and students who really like the Google community and the asynchronous discussions, and people who really just like being face-to-face in class and interacting that way. So what we need to create, if you will, is an ecosystem of different ways of learning, where students can navigate to the niche that's working for them, for that particular subject, for that particular time. And sometimes it may be a lecture, and sometimes it may be a virtual world. But the point is, there's no single best way of doing it. And what I'm trying to do in my own work with my colleagues is to broaden that ecosystem by introducing new kinds of niches that may work some of the time for students.
Chris, also, I think it's Tarek or Tariq wanted to know if you think that new technologies are taking us away from more of an objectivist model, closer to a constructivist model. And then the follow-up question was, or are we using AI and augmented reality to create a more appealing Skinner's learning machine?
Well, first, I'm familiar with Skinner's learning machine. Of course, that was developed at Harvard. I have no interest in creating things that are like that. But I do think that the personalization of learning is important, and I've tried to illustrate how technologies can be a kind of mirror that we can hold up to ourselves, and we can look in the mirror and we can see how we're doing and where we're succeeding and where we're not succeeding, not being programmed, but getting feedback. I think that role for technology is very helpful. You're using some terms that not everyone may be familiar with, objectivist and social constructivist. Basically, I believe that people do construct their own knowledge, that you can be told something and you can repeat it, but you don't really understand it unless you experience it and apply it on your own. So to that extent, I'm a constructivist. And I also believe that people do that best when they're interacting with other people and making meaning together and collaborating. So I'm a social constructivist, but I'm a guided social constructivist because I don't believe that kids just reinventing civilization together from scratch in classrooms is a great idea. I think that guidance and the infusion of knowledge out of history and standing on the shoulders of others who've come before is very important to effective and efficient learning. And so it's a complex dance where you're helping people to confront the unknown and to struggle with it, but you're right there to provide different kinds of guidance and to help them get as far as they can and as far as they want to. That's why I think the whole issue of learning and unlearning these new forms of pedagogy is going to be the crucial thing that determines whether we succeed or fail in applying all these new and interesting technologies.
And then just a couple more questions. Jim had asked about your thoughts on risk as a dimension of learning, and that how sometimes simulations may have a tendency to mitigate risk.
I think that actually simulations offer opportunities for risk if they're well designed. If you're not just being guided through the simulation and marching along some kind of linear path, but in fact it's a very open-ended experience in which you have a lot of autonomy and choice, you can take risks of different kinds and you can see whether the risk paid off or not, and you don't have the kinds of consequences that might happen in the real world if you were to take a similar risk. That's why so many places use simulations and games of different kinds to teach pilots, to teach surgeons and doctors, to teach first responders, because it provides a way of learning about risk in a safe way. And what we want to encourage students to do in middle school, students by middle school often feel that they're failures. They often feel that they can't understand math, that they can't understand science. And if you put them in a virtual environment or an augmented reality where you give them the chance to wear a different set of shoes, to play at being a scientist, they find often that they can do it, especially if they're learning in a way that speaks to how they like to learn rather than the one-size-fits-all lecture method. So I think it's about identity, and risk is a part of forming your identity, and I think well-designed simulations can help with that.
And then Chris, do you feel like have you had experience or just with sometimes when we customize learning and offer what you're saying, that kind of a broad offering of niches in the ecosystem, there's an increased cost in making those systems available to a multitude of students. How do you deal with the increased cost? Are there strategies? Are there ways to kind of offset that?
Well, a lot of schools now are moving to one-to-one. And as soon as tablets become powerful enough, they can do things like the EcoMove without any additional cost. I mean, if we're giving it away, or even if we were going to charge for it, but 5 million students are using it, the cost is actually negligible. And so I don't see economics as a really big barrier. For that matter, EcoMobile and augmented realities throughout life, people have smartphones. It's difficult to design a good augmented reality, but it's not difficult to build an augmented reality. I think that the real cost is the cost of education failing. The terrible cost that we're facing now is, 30% of 40% of students often in many areas not finishing high school, or not really achieving their dreams and having to settle for some kind of a job that they hate because they were taught in a way that didn't really allow them to achieve their potential to do the job that they would love. So I think that the cost that scares me is the cost of prisons and the cost of welfare and the cost of discouraged people in a democracy who don't even want to bother to vote or who don't understand the issues that they're voting on. That's the cost that worries me. I think the cost of investing in education to drive down those other costs is minuscule by comparison.
And just kind of a nuts and bolts question to round out the conversation. What tools did you use to actually create EcoMove and EcoMobile?
So EcoMove is built in Unity, which is a terrific authoring shell out of the gaming community. It runs on all sorts of devices with different operating systems. It'll even run on a cell phone if you have a really powerful cell phone, although the screen is pretty small. And it's very robust, so we're able to develop in it and then release it, and schools can just run it in a web browser, so they don't really have to install a bunch of software in order to do these digital ecosystems. EcoMobile, we're experimenting with different authoring shells for augmented reality. One of them is called Fresh Air, AIR. One of them is called Eris. Another is called Tailblazer. These are all available for free on the Play Store and in the iStore, so if you want to experiment with augmented reality, experiencing it, or maybe constructing some, you can do that as well. So the tools are really becoming robust and practical, and our websites talk more about how to get involved with those.
Thank you so much. This has been just a wealth of information, and we just really appreciate having you with us today. I don't even know where to start. Just the apps that I'm excited to bring these apps back to my science department and back to my school. And I know that a lot of people in the chat and discussion have said they're going to take some time and process everything that you brought forth today. So this has been wonderful.
Well, thanks to all of you for coming. And I'm looking forward to do something I haven't had the chance to do, which is to look at the really rich discussion thread and get some insights and ideas out of that that'll be helpful for me. So this is a great learning experience for me as well.
And it looks like some people are now sharing ideas on how they've used AR or mobile devices within their classes. And right now, while we have about 150 people left in the room, as a thank you to Chris, if you could maybe just share ideas or your takeaways in the discussion thread, that would be wonderful, and then he can look at those later. And Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you again, and thanks to all of you for coming.
All right. So at this time, we have a couple of closing polls, and if you could just put your thoughts and ratings down below, that would be wonderful. And if you're unfamiliar with the Adobe EdXchange, I just want to bring a little attention to what we offer. We have a few members to our Education Exchange. I think we're over 200,000 now. And if you would like to investigate upcoming events that we offer in the EdXchange, I'll provide that link to you. And if you're unaware that we offer courses for professional learning with creativity and tools such as After Effects and Edge Animate and Dreamweaver. And if you haven't heard about the Connected initiative yet, you can head over to edx.adobe.com/connected. Title I schools are encouraged to apply and receive some Adobe software. There's all sorts of opportunities there to collaborate and partner with different organizations and different companies. As always, we'd love for you to check our other professional development events. If you go to edx.adobe.com/professional-development/events,